My mom traded her favorite little boy for her lover's fat son and threw me to the streets the moment I came into a $10 million inheritance. We'll never sleep in the same bed again after that. When I was 14, my life turned upside down. My mom, Kelly, remarried, and not just anyone, she married a guy named Jack. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mom had been lonely since splitting up with my dad, and Jack seemed okay in the couple of short meetings we had before the wedding. But things got complicated fast. Jack wasn't just moving in, he was bringing someone else along, his son, Michael. Michael was 3 years older than me, and to say we didn't hit it off would be an understatement. Honestly, we barely even spoke. The first time we were left alone together, the silence was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. He sat there with this distant look, like he was counting down the seconds until he could leave, and I couldn't blame him, I felt the same way. But as awkward as things were with Michael, it was nothing compared to what was coming with Jack. At first glance, Jack seemed great. He was friendly, polite, and knew how to charm people. But once he settled into our house, something shifted. It was like the mask came off. Suddenly, he was laying down rules, lots of them. And for some reason, they all seemed aimed at me. I had to ask his permission to go out, and he even had opinions about which friends I should hang out with. It felt like he saw me as a project to fix rather than someone he'd agreed to share a house with. Whenever I went to my mom to complain, she just shrugged it off. "He's just trying to look out for you," she'd say, or "he's setting boundaries." But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really listening. The more I tried to tell her how unfair it all was, the more it seemed like she was focused on keeping Jack happy instead of me. It hurt. A lot. I felt like I'd lost the mom I used to know. One time, I went to her practically in tears, telling her about something Jack had done that really upset me. She sighed, barely looking up, and brushed me off like I was being dramatic. Sitting there, I couldn't help but wonder if she even saw me anymore. The breaking point came when I was invited to a friend's birthday party, a small, casual thing at her house. Jack flat out refused to let me go, saying he didn't know my friends well enough to trust them. Mom stood right there, nodding like she agreed with him. I was livid. I begged them to let me go, but they wouldn't budge. Meanwhile, Michael got to do whatever he wanted. He could come and go as he pleased, no questions asked. It felt like there were two sets of rules in the house, and I was stuck with the worst ones. I ended up storming off to my room, feeling like I was living with strangers. My own family didn't feel like mine anymore. It was becoming painfully clear that no one in the house cared about me, not even a little. Then came the incident with my phone. Jack decided out of the blue that he needed to monitor my online activity, which really meant snatching my phone whenever he felt like it. He'd scroll through my messages, poke through my apps, and invade every corner of my privacy like it was no big deal. It was humiliating and infuriating. Mom, of course, backed him up every single time. "He's just trying to protect you," she'd say, like that made it okay. But protect me from what? My friends? My own life? It didn't feel like protection. It felt like control. Like he was just flexing his authority because he could. That's when I started hiding things, keeping little secrets just so I could have something that felt like mine. Michael, though, he was in a totally different world. Jack's overbearing rules didn't seem to touch him at all. He'd come and go without a word, stay out late, and even pull stunts that would have had me grounded for weeks. Jack didn't seem to care. In fact, he seemed to favor Michael, and I couldn't figure out why. They'd even go out together on weekends, leaving Mom and me behind. It was like they were some kind of team, and I was just the extra piece nobody asked for. Not that Michael looked particularly happy about it either, but at least he wasn't treated like an outsider in his own home. That's exactly what I felt like, an outsider. Every day, the house felt less like a home and more like a cage. I started keeping to myself, hiding in my room whenever I could. Anything to avoid Jack's constant rules or Michael's distant, uninterested attitude. Even when I was around them, I might as well have been invisible. They'd talk over me, make plans without including me, and Mom? She just went along with it, all like nothing was wrong. I kept waiting for her to step in, to stand up for me, to do something to remind me that I mattered. But she never did. The final straw came one evening. Jack had taken my laptop, claiming he needed to check what I'd been doing online. I was furious, absolutely livid. It felt like a complete violation of my privacy, like he had no respect for me at all. I stormed downstairs, shouting at him to give it back, telling him he had no right to treat me this way. He just stared at me, cold and emotionless, and said, "As long as you're living under my roof, you'll follow my rules." That was it. That single sentence crushed me. I felt like a complete stranger in my own home. And the one person I thought I could count on, my mom, just stood there. I turned to her, desperate, practically begging her with my eyes to do something, to tell him he was out of line. But she just looked away, like she was embarrassed. I felt my heart shatter right there. I wasn't just mad, I was devastated. The mom I'd always relied on wasn't there anymore. She'd been replaced by someone who seemed more concerned about keeping Jack happy than protecting me. After that, I stopped fighting. I stopped trying altogether. I just went through the motions, kept my head down, and stayed out of everyone's way. It felt like I was fading into the background of my own life, and no one even noticed. Jack and I barely exchanged words, and when we did, every interaction was heavy with tension, like we were forcing ourselves to act civil. Michael kept his distance too, which was fine by me. We weren't a family, we were strangers, stuck under one roof, each of us just trying to get through the day. But the worst part wasn't the fighting or the awkward silences. It was the loneliness. I felt isolated in a way I'd never experienced before. It was like being surrounded by people but feeling completely unseen. My friends couldn't understand. They all had normal families with normal problems. How could I explain what it felt like to be an outsider in my own home, to feel like I didn't belong anywhere? I didn't want anyone to know how miserable I really was, so I bottled everything up. I remember one night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had turned into this. I felt trapped, desperate to escape. The thought of running away crossed my mind, just leaving and never coming back. But I was still a kid. Where would I go? How would I survive? As much as I hated it, I knew I didn't have the means to make it on my own. So, I started withdrawing even more. I figured if I stayed quiet and kept to myself, I could avoid Jack's attention and escape his constant criticism. But even that didn't work. Jack always found something to tear me down about. He'd make cruel comments about my appearance, my friends, even my grades. It didn't matter how hard I tried, nothing I did was ever good enough for him. And Mom, she just stood by and let it happen. She defended him every single time, taking his side no matter what. That's when it hit me. Mom wasn't going to rescue me. She wasn't going to stand up to Jack or protect me. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. That realization hurt worse than anything Jack ever said or did. It broke something inside me, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, so I started planning. I didn't have a concrete idea of what I was going to do, but I knew I needed to get out. I took babysitting jobs whenever I could and saved every penny. I stashed the money away, imagining the day I'd finally leave and start a life of my own. But life has a funny way of appending even the best-laid plans. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, something happened that changed everything. I found out something shocking about Jack, something so big it had the potential to shatter our family. For the first time, I realized I might not be as powerless as I'd always felt. Around a year after Jack and Mom got married, she sat me down and told me she was pregnant. For a brief moment, I felt something strange. Hope. Maybe this baby could change things. Maybe it would bring us closer as a family. Maybe it could fix what felt so broken. I wanted something positive to hold on to, something that might finally make our house feel like a home. When my mom told me she was pregnant, I dared to hope. I'd always wanted a younger sibling, and for a split second, I let myself believe this baby could be the thing to bring us together. When Ben was born, he was instantly treated like a little miracle. Mom and Jack doted on him endlessly, marveling over every coo and gurgle like he was the most extraordinary baby in the world. At first, I tried to be happy for them. Truly, I did. I spent hours in his nursery, rocking him to sleep or helping out in any way I could, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally feel like I belonged in this family. But it didn't take long to realize that Ben wasn't just the new baby, he was the golden child. Every tiny thing he did was celebrated like it was groundbreaking. His first laugh, his first little wave, it was like they thought he was rewriting the rules of human development. Meanwhile, I felt myself slipping further and further into the background. At first, it was subtle. Small things, like Mom brushing me off when I asked for help with homework because she was too busy with Ben, or Jack interrupting me to gush about something cute Ben had done. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. One day, it all came crashing down for me. I'd worked tirelessly on a school project, pouring hours into it, staying up late to make it perfect. When I got a perfect score, I was so proud, I couldn't wait to share it. I walked into the living room, clutching the project in my hands, eager to show them what I'd accomplished. But as I stepped in, I realized they didn't even notice I was there. All their attention was on Ben, who was taking his first wobbly steps between the coffee table and the couch. They were cheering like he'd just won an Olympic gold medal. I froze, standing there with my project, and it hit me. Nothing I did would ever measure up to anything Ben did. My accomplishments were invisible in the glow of his milestones. And it only got worse as Ben got older. He became the center of their world. They spoiled him endlessly with toys, affection, and attention, things I'd stopped expecting a long time ago. I'd watch from the sidelines, wondering if they even remembered I existed. They didn't seem to notice when I'd quietly slip out of the room or spend hours alone in my bedroom, trying to mask how much it hurt. Eventually, everything in the house started to change, all for Ben's benefit, of course. They transformed the spare room into a playroom just for him, filling it with every toy imaginable. It was as if every corner of the house revolved around him, while I was left wondering where I even fit in anymore. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. That room had once been my mom's home office, a quiet space where she and I would sometimes sit together, working side by side. It held so many memories of when I still felt connected to her. But now, it was transformed into Ben's personal kingdom, and I was just a stranger in his world. Then one day, Jack and Mom sat me down for a family discussion. They said they needed to make more space for Ben's things. That's when they told me I'd have to give up my room so he could have a proper nursery. My room, my one sanctuary in this house, was being taken from me. As they talked, explaining their reasoning as though it was some noble sacrifice I should be happy to make, I felt the walls closing in. They said I'd be moving to the small guest room at the end of the hall, a cramped little space barely big enough for a bed and a desk. There was no room for my books, my decorations, my life. It felt like they were pushing me further and further out, both physically and emotionally. I tried to argue, to make them see how unfair it was, how much my room meant to me. But they dismissed me without a second thought. "It's only temporary," they said, their words hollow and meaningless. I'd heard that before. I already knew how permanent their decisions could be when it came to Ben. They'd made their choice. He was the one who mattered. After that, I became invisible. Jack and Mom poured all their attention into Ben. Every giggle, every stumble, every tiny milestone was met with cheers and adoration. Meanwhile, I could have disappeared, and I doubted they'd even notice. My achievements, my struggles, my very presence, it all went unnoticed. Even Michael, who had never been particularly close to me, seemed more distant than ever. He was lost in his own world, and we passed each other in the halls like ghosts, both of us trapped in the same house but utterly alone. I tried to talk to my mom. I wanted her to see how much this was hurting me, to make her realize that I still needed her. I wanted to remind her that I was still here, waiting, desperate for her attention. But every time I brought it up, she brushed me off. "You're too old to be jealous of a baby," she'd say. "You need to grow up and learn to share." I'd already given up so much. I'd sacrificed my comfort, my privacy, my sense of belonging, for their happiness. And now they wanted more. It felt like I was being erased, bit by bit, until there'd be nothing left of me at all. Then came the final blow. Jack and Mom decided to throw a huge party for Ben's 3rd birthday. They spared no expense. There were balloons in every corner, extravagant decorations, and enough food to feed a small army. They fussed over every last detail, determined to make the day absolutely perfect for their precious little boy. Meanwhile, I thought back to my last birthday. It had been barely acknowledged, a store-bought cake, a few mumbled happy birthdays, and nothing more. No decorations, no party, no excitement. Watching them go all out for Ben was like a punch to the gut. I stood there in the chaos of party preparations, surrounded by laughter and celebration, and I realized just how forgotten I was. It was clear, I wasn't part of this family anymore. I was just there. Birthdays thrown my way, it was painfully clear who mattered to them, and it wasn't me. As Ben's party went on, I felt myself sinking deeper into despair. I stood in the corner, watching them celebrate his life with laughter and joy, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I couldn't take it anymore. Quietly, I slipped out the back door and found a secluded spot in the backyard where I could finally breathe. I sat there, staring up at the stars, wondering if anyone would even notice if I disappeared. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I had disappeared, at least in their eyes. I was just an inconvenience, a shadow lurking on the edges of their perfect little family. At some point, I stopped trying to make them see me, stopped hoping for connection, for love, for anything. All I had left was the quiet, lonely realization that I was truly alone. By the time I turned 18, I felt like a complete stranger in my own house. After years of being ignored, cast aside, and even pushed out of my room, I knew it was time to make a change. I'd been saving up every penny I could from part-time jobs, babysitting gigs, anything I could find. Little by little, I'd built a stash, my secret lifeline, and a glimmer of hope in a world that felt like it was suffocating me. Leaving wasn't a decision I made lightly. A part of me still wanted to hold on, to cling to the idea that maybe, someday, Mom would see me again. That she'd recognize how she'd let me fade into the background. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. She and Jack had their perfect little family centered around Ben, the golden child, and I was nothing more than an afterthought. I had to leave, for my own sanity, for my own survival. One night, I finally worked up the courage to tell them my plans. Dinner had long since ended, and Ben was asleep upstairs. Mom was sitting on the couch flipping through a magazine, while Jack sat in his usual spot, glued to the news. My heart was pounding as I took a deep breath and said, "I'm moving out next week. I've saved enough to get an apartment." The room went silent. I could feel their eyes on me, filled with shock and disbelief. Jack was the first to speak, his voice sharp and cold. "Are you serious, Emma? And when exactly were you planning to tell us this?" "I'm telling you now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though it trembled slightly. "I've been saving for a long time, and I need to do this for myself." Mom looked hurt, like I'd just betrayed her. She put down her magazine and said, "Emmy, this is sudden. You don't even know what it's like out there. It's hard, it's expensive, and you have a good home here. Why would you want to leave?" "A good home." The words tumbled out of me, years of frustration and pain spilling over like a dam had burst. I haven't felt like I belonged here since Jack moved in. A heavy weight pressing down on me, but I didn't let it stop me. As I closed the trunk and turned back toward the house, I saw them all standing there. Mom holding Ben on her hip, Michael lingering in the background, and Jack with his arms crossed, a hard set to his jaw. "Take care of yourself," Mom said again, her voice barely above a whisper. It was all she could manage, and I knew there'd be no heartfelt goodbye, no last-minute apology or acknowledgement of what I'd gone through. Jack just stood there, his glare cold and unyielding. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. It screamed disapproval, anger, and maybe even satisfaction that I was finally out of his way. Michael, leaning against the doorframe, gave me a brief nod, his expression unreadable. I wondered, for a fleeting moment, if he was silently wishing me luck or just relieved he didn't have to deal with the awkwardness anymore. I took a deep breath and turned away. The house, once a place of warmth and love, now felt like a fortress I was finally escaping. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. I felt sadness, knowing I was leaving behind the life I'd grown up with, and fear, wondering if I could really make it on my own. But there was also excitement, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I was finally taking control of my life. And above all, I felt relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't suffocating. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back one last time. Mom was still standing there, holding Ben, but her face was unreadable. Jack had already turned away, disappearing inside without a second thought. And Michael, he was staring down at the ground, distant as ever. It hurt. It hurt more than I expected. But as the house shrank in my rearview mirror, so did the weight I'd carried for so long. For the first time, I wasn't just running away, I was running toward something. Toward freedom, toward independence, toward the chance to finally be seen, even if only by myself. But it only highlighted how distant I felt from all of them. As I sat there in the corner, watching Mom stroke Jack's hand and Ben chatter away about his day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger. Michael, still scrolling through his phone, barely looked up the entire time. It was like I was invisible again, just like I'd always been in that house. Jack glanced at me occasionally, his expression hard to read. Was he grateful I came, annoyed, or just indifferent? I couldn't tell, and honestly, I wasn't sure if it mattered anymore. The hours dragged on, and I felt more and more out of place. I wondered why I'd come at all. Maybe I thought this would be my chance to confront Jack, to finally say all the things I'd kept bottled up over the years. Or maybe, deep down, I hoped for some sort of reconciliation, a moment where he'd admit he'd been unfair, that he'd treated me poorly. But that moment never came. Instead, the room was filled with their voices, their connection, their bond. Ben made jokes to lighten the mood, and Mom smiled at him, her eyes soft with pride. Even Jack managed a weak chuckle at something Ben said, his voice raspy but warm in a way I'd never heard when he spoke to me. I stayed quiet, unsure of what to say or do. The longer I sat there, the more I realized this wasn't about me. It never had been. Jack's illness had brought them closer together, but it had only pushed me further to the margins. When the nurse came in to check Jack's vitals, I took it as my cue to leave. I stood up, clearing my throat awkwardly. I should get going, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom looked up at me, her expression unreadable. Thanks for coming, Emmy, she said, but there was no warmth in her tone. Just politeness. Jack didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I thought I saw something there, regret, maybe? Or was it just the exhaustion from his illness? I couldn't tell, and I didn't have the energy to figure it out. Michael didn't even glance up as I walked out, and Ben barely noticed I was leaving. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. I hadn't found the answers I was looking for, and I hadn't gotten the apology I secretly hoped for. But something about being there, seeing them all together, made me realize I'd been right to leave when I did. I'd carved out a life for myself, one where I wasn't an afterthought, and I wasn't going to let their dynamic pull me back into that shadow. As I walked out of the hospital, I took a deep breath. The air felt cool and sharp, like a reminder that I was still free. I didn't need their validation anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally letting go. Worth anymore. Jack's decision hurt. It cut deeper than I wanted to admit, but it also freed me in a way I hadn't expected. It was the final confirmation of what I'd always known but struggled to accept. I wasn't a part of their family, not in the way that mattered to them. And that was okay, because I didn't need to be. After I hung up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time, letting the reality of it sink in. The tears came eventually, hot and relentless, but when they stopped, I felt lighter. This wasn't closure in the way I'd imagined, but it was a kind of ending. An acknowledgement that the chapter with Jack and Mom, the one where I'd spent so much energy fighting for a place in their lives, was over. In the weeks that followed, I let go of the expectations I'd been holding onto for so long. The hurt lingered, sharp and raw, but it was mixed with something else, clarity. I didn't need their approval or validation. I didn't need to fit into their version of a family. I'd already built a life for myself, however imperfect, and it was mine. I started focusing on the small victories I'd achieved over the years, getting my own apartment, paying my bills, building a network of friends who truly cared about me. These were things no one could take away, not Jack, not Mom, not anyone. When I thought about Jack's will, I realized something important. I didn't need his money or his recognition to prove my worth. His choices didn't define me. The inheritance, or lack of it, wasn't a reflection of who I was or what I deserved. It was simply another reminder of who he was, and I didn't have to carry that weight anymore. As time went on, I felt the bitterness begin to fade. It didn't disappear completely, and maybe it never would, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, I found strength in the life I was creating. I found joy in the freedom of shaping my own path, far away from their rules, their favoritism, and their dismissiveness. For the first time in years, I felt at peace, not because they'd changed, but because I had. I didn't need to belong to their family anymore. I belonged to myself, and that was more than enough. When Mom wasn't looking. Aunt Sarah had always seemed warm and kind in those hazy memories, but she'd become more of a ghost from my past than a real presence in my life. Hearing her name now, attached to something as significant as a will, left me momentarily speechless. "Are you still there, Miss Carter?" the woman on the phone prompted, breaking through my confusion. Yes, I'm here," I said, trying to collect myself. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I hadn't been in touch with Aunt Sarah for years. Are you sure this is correct?" Marla's tone softened, professional but reassuring. "I understand this may come as a surprise, but Ms. Sarah Carter was very clear in her wishes. She named you as the primary beneficiary of her estate. It includes some savings, personal belongings, and a small property. I'd like to schedule a meeting to go over the details with you, if you're available." A small property. Savings. My mind raced. This felt surreal, like a plot twist in someone else's life. I stammered out a response, agreeing to meet with her that Friday afternoon. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. My thoughts kept drifting back to Aunt Sarah. Why would she leave me her estate? We hadn't spoken in years, and I had no idea she'd even thought about me, let alone cared enough to leave me something so significant. That Friday, I found myself sitting in a modest office across from Marla Gray, who handed me a folder filled with legal documents. "Ms. Carter left this property to you, a small house just outside the city," she explained. "She also left a letter addressed to you." My heart pounded as I unfolded the envelope, the handwriting instantly taking me back to childhood. It was undeniably hers, looping and confident. I started reading. "Dear Emmy, I'm not sure if you'll even remember me, but I remember you. I remember a sweet little girl who always smiled, even when life didn't make it easy for her. I regret losing touch after your parents divorced. I wish I'd been there for you, especially during the hard times. I know I can't make up for that now, but I want you to have something of mine, a place that feels like yours, where you can find the peace and belonging you've always deserved. You're stronger than you know, and I hope this house becomes a fresh start for you." Tears blurred the words as I read them. Aunt Sarah had seen me, really seen me, in a way no one else in my family ever had. She had thought about me, cared about me, even when I thought I was forgotten. In the days that followed, I visited the house, a cozy one-story home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was perfect. For the first time, I felt like I had a place that was truly mine, not just in the physical sense, but emotionally too. Aunt Sarah's gift wasn't just the house. It was the validation I hadn't realized I needed. She reminded me that I mattered, even when I'd convinced myself otherwise. Her kindness was a beacon, showing me that family doesn't have to be defined by blood or proximity. It's about who sees you and loves you for who you are. From that moment on, I decided to honor Aunt Sarah's memory by embracing the life she believed I deserved. I finally let go of the bitterness, the resentment, and the ache of rejection. I had my own life, my own home, and my own sense of self-worth, and for the first time, I felt whole. Her house as a kid, the way it smelled faintly of lavender and baked goods, her boisterous laugh that could light up a room, and how she'd sneak me candy when Mom wasn't looking. Those memories were hazy, fragments of a childhood I'd long buried under years of pain and rejection, but now they came rushing back. I couldn't understand why Aunt Sarah would leave me such a massive inheritance. $7 million. It was beyond anything I could have imagined. All those years, scraping by and feeling like I didn't matter, and here she was, proving me wrong from beyond the grave. Her words in the will stuck with me. She'd seen the unfairness, the heartbreak, and she'd cared enough to try and make it right. Knowing that felt like both a blessing and a wound reopening. She'd wanted to be part of my life, but my mother's choices had kept her away. How much different would my life have been if she'd been there? The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone, not even my closest friends. It felt too big, too personal, like speaking it aloud would somehow make it less real. Instead, I focused on practicalities, meeting with financial advisors, signing the necessary paperwork, and figuring out what to do next. Sitting alone in my tiny apartment, I thought about what this money could mean. It was more than just financial freedom. It was an opportunity to build the life I'd always dreamed of, a life where I wasn't struggling just to stay afloat, where I could finally breathe. But it also felt like a responsibility, a final gift from someone who had believed in me when no one else had. I decided I wasn't going to waste it. Aunt Sarah had given me the chance to rewrite my story, and I owed it to her, and to myself, to make it count. Over the next few months, I started making changes. I moved into a modest but beautiful home, a place that felt warm and welcoming, a place that was mine. I paid off debts, invested wisely, and even donated a portion of the inheritance to causes I knew Aunt Sarah would have cared about. But the biggest change wasn't material. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, valued, and empowered. Aunt Sarah's gift reminded me that my worth wasn't defined by Jack, Mom, or anyone else who had made me feel small. It was a reminder that even when I felt invisible, someone had noticed me, cared about me, and believed I deserved better. On quiet nights, I'd sit in my new living room, sipping tea and thinking about Aunt Sarah. I'd imagine her laughing, her vibrant personality filling the space, and I'd feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Her love, though distant and delayed, had changed everything for me. In her own way, Aunt Sarah had given me not just a financial inheritance, but something much more valuable, the belief that I mattered, and the freedom to finally live a life on my own terms. Jack's call was the final straw. Hearing his voice, so unapologetic and entitled, brought years of resentment roaring back to the surface. How dare he? After everything, his coldness, his rules, the constant reminder that I didn't belong, he now had the audacity to ask for my help? I didn't hold back. Every ounce of pain, bitterness, and frustration I'd bottled up over the years came spilling out. I reminded him of every cruel comment, every moment he'd made me feel invisible, every choice that had pushed me further away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. My words were sharp, cutting through the silence on the other end of the line. When I was done, there was nothing but quiet. For a moment, I thought he'd hung up. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "I see," he said, and the call ended. I sat there for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand. The satisfaction of standing up to him felt hollow. It didn't erase the years of hurt, the nights I'd spent crying in my room, or the ache of being excluded from my own family. But it was a step, a declaration that I wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, take advantage of me anymore. As the days passed, the calls from relatives kept coming. They tried every angle: guilt, nostalgia, even outright flattery. Some insisted that Aunt Sarah would have wanted me to share the money, while others hinted at their own financial struggles, hoping I'd offer to help. Mom's call was the hardest. She didn't even bother to hide her motives, waxing poetic about family and how Aunt Sarah's generosity could benefit everyone. "You know," she said in a sugary tone, "it would really mean a lot if you could help us out. We're still family, Emmy." I could hear the false warmth in her voice, and it made my stomach churn. "Family," I replied, my voice cold. "Where was this family when I needed you? When Jack rewrote his will to exclude me? When you stood by and let me be pushed aside over and over again?" She stammered, trying to respond, but I didn't let her. "You didn't stand up for me then, and I'm done waiting for you to care now. Aunt Sarah gave me this inheritance because she saw me when no one else did, and I'm not going to let anyone guilt me into giving it away." I hung up before she could say more, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. Cutting ties had been the hardest decision I'd ever made, but moments like this reminded me why it was necessary. Over time, the calls dwindled. I made it clear that my life and Aunt Sarah's gift were not up for discussion. The money wasn't just a windfall, it was a symbol of the love and validation I'd craved for so long. It was a chance to build something meaningful, not just for me, but as a way of honoring the aunt who had cared when no one else had. I started putting my plans into motion. I went back to school, something I'd dreamed of but never thought I could afford. I traveled to places I'd only seen in books and movies, soaking in the world and all its beauty. I even began volunteering, using some of Aunt Sarah's gift to support causes that aligned with her values. The hurt from my family didn't disappear, but it began to lose its grip on me. With every step forward, I felt lighter, freer. I wasn't just the forgotten daughter anymore, or the girl who had been pushed aside. I was someone who mattered, someone who had taken the pain of her past and turned it into a future worth living for. Aunt Sarah's generosity gave me the means to start over, but it was her belief in me that gave me the strength. And for that, I would always be grateful. "Everything, you're asking me for money." My voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. Mom hesitated for a moment, then sighed heavily. "Emmy, that was different. Jack was. He wasn't thinking clearly. You know how things were back then. Back then. I shot back, the bitterness bubbling to the surface. Mom, you stood by and let it happen. You let him treat me like I didn't belong. And now, after all that, you're coming to me with your hand out? Don't you see how wrong that is? Her voice trembled, either from frustration or guilt. We're family, Emmy. Families help each other. Aunt Sarah would want you to help us. I couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, humorless sound. You mean the same Aunt Sarah you wanted nothing to do with? The one who only left me this inheritance because she saw what you and Jack refused to see, that I was alone, struggling, and abandoned by my own family. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she might finally acknowledge the hurt she'd caused. But when she spoke again, her voice was cold and defensive. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, Emmy. I hope you'll think about what I've said. I have thought about it, Mom, I replied firmly. And the answer is no. I hung up before she could say anything else, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. I hated that it had come to this, but I knew I'd made the right choice. Aunt Sarah's inheritance wasn't just money, it was a lifeline, a gift from someone who had cared about me when no one else did. I wasn't about to let the people who had pushed me aside guilt me into giving it away. Over the next few weeks, the calls and messages kept coming. Relatives tried every tactic, from guilt trips to outright demands, but I stood my ground. I'd spent years seeking their approval, hoping to feel like I belonged, but Aunt Sarah had taught me something invaluable. I didn't need their validation. Instead, I focused on the foundation I'd created in Aunt Sarah's name. Every time I saw the impact we were making, helping young people from difficult family backgrounds find stability, education, and support, I felt a deep sense of purpose. I was no longer the forgotten daughter, the outsider looking in. I had my own family now, a family of people I could help, people who needed someone to believe in them, just as Aunt Sarah had believed in me. For the first time in my life, I felt at peace. I wasn't defined by my past or the family who had cast me aside. I was free, and I was finally living the life Aunt Sarah had always wanted for me. Sense of clarity I'd never experienced before. Aunt Sarah's inheritance wasn't just about money, it was a wake-up call. It had revealed the true colors of the people I'd spent so many years trying to please, the same people who had ignored me, pushed me aside, and only remembered I existed when they thought they could benefit. The failed lawsuit was the last straw. I cut ties completely, blocking numbers, deleting messages, and refusing to entertain even the most distant relatives' attempts to contact me. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of the games, the guilt, the constant battle to prove myself to people who clearly didn't value me. Instead, I focused on what mattered. With the inheritance securely in my name, I poured my energy into Aunt Sarah's foundation. Every grant we awarded, every young person we helped, felt like a small victory. It was my way of honoring the woman who had cared about me when no one else did, the woman who had seen my worth even when I couldn't. I also started investing in myself. I took classes, traveled to places I'd only dreamed of, and even indulged in hobbies I'd long abandoned. Slowly, I began to build a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, a life that wasn't defined by my past or the approval of others. Looking back, I realized Aunt Sarah's gift wasn't just about giving me financial security. It was about giving me freedom. Freedom to let go of toxic relationships, freedom to carve out my own path, and freedom to finally be at peace with who I was. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore, nor was I the girl who needed to prove her worth to a family that had never truly seen her. I was my own person, strong, independent, and whole. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just feel free. I felt happy. That strange sense of freedom grew into something even more profound, a genuine opportunity to rediscover who I was. For the first time in years, I could focus on myself without the weight of anyone else's expectations or demands holding me down. I threw myself into building a new life, surrounding myself with people who genuinely cared about me. Friends who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them, not for the money Aunt Sarah had left me, but for the person I was becoming. These relationships felt like sunlight after years of darkness, warming parts of me I thought I'd lost forever. At the same time, I began exploring career paths I'd only dreamed about before. With the financial stability Aunt Sarah's inheritance provided, I was finally able to take risks. I enrolled in courses, attended workshops, and networked with people in industries that fascinated me. Bit by bit, I started building a future that was truly mine, a life defined by my passions, not my past. But as liberating as it all was, the journey wasn't without its struggles. Years of self-doubt lingered in the back of my mind, whispering that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve the happiness I was chasing. It was a battle to quiet those voices, to unlearn the belief that my worth was tied to how others treated me. Therapy became an anchor in those moments of doubt. Through it, I started unpacking the years of pain and rejection I'd carried with me, peeling back the layers of hurt to finally understand how deeply it had shaped me. I learned to forgive myself for the choices I'd made out of desperation, the times I'd begged for scraps of love, the moments I'd stayed silent when I should have spoken up. The support of my new friends helped, too. They cheered me on through every victory, no matter how small, and reminded me that I was capable of so much more than I gave myself credit for. Bit by bit, I began to let go of the past. I stopped defining myself by the family who had cast me aside and started embracing the person I was becoming. Someone who was strong, independent, and worthy of happiness. The money Aunt Sarah left me wasn't just a financial blessing, it was a second chance. It gave me the freedom to dream, to grow, and to build a life I never thought I'd have. But more than that, it reminded me of something far more valuable. I mattered. I always had. And now, I was finally starting to believe it.